Hello and welcome to Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast. Today, our special guest is Kirk Edelman. Kirk works for SolMicrogrid, and we're going to try to figure out what SolMicrogrid does. There's so many different definitions of microgrid out there. So, Kirk, what does SolMicrogrid do?
Yeah, first off, Sean, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, microgrids are largely misunderstood by a lot of people out there in the business. But we at Sol Microgrid, basically, we develop our own and operate microgrid systems. What makes us a little bit unique is, well, that kind of makes us unique right out of the box. But beyond that, we do it on an energy as a service basis. So our model is build, own, operate, not build and sell. And that provides us with a host of benefits, which I think makes our offerings very attractive.
Yeah, and one thing that I noticed when I was looking through some of your materials there, and like you just said, energy as a service. And I'm always used to seeing people talk about SaaS, software as a service. And I'm in Silicon Valley and all that. And so you have kind of used that. Are other people doing that, EaaS?
I suspect they are, but it's not as widely available as the traditional build and sell approach to this business.
So with sauce, they pronounce it like steak sauce or something like that, or for vegetarians, maybe Worcestershire sauce, if I'm pronouncing that right. So that's called an acronym. With EaaS, I don't know how I would pronounce that as an acronym, so maybe you just have to go with the abbreviation EaaS or EaaS. How do you do it?
We tend to just spell out the acronym EaaS. But as we talk today, we've got a couple of other ones too.
Oh,
I'm
great.
a big fan of trying to take a complex issue, make it easy to understand, and then have a name that people can remember.
Okay, great. All right. So as you were saying.
Yeah, so we develop, own, operate microgrid systems. There's a lot of purists out there, Sean, and you kind of hinted at this a moment ago, who will say that in order to really have a microgrid, you have to have the ability to have full resiliency. In other words, you have to be able to operate fully independent from the grid when there are grid interruptions, and you have to be able to provide the host with the full energy that they need so that they can be basically indifferent from using grid power versus microgrid power. That's sort of the technical approach to it. So I think probably a more accurate description of what we do is we develop, own, and operate energy projects that use a variety of distributed energy resources, DER, another acronym.
Yep.
And I think that if I said that's what we do, there's a lot of folks out there who probably let out a deep breath and say, okay, now he's accurate. So some of our customers don't need full resiliency. Some would prefer no resiliency because they don't think it's a big operating risk. Others want a bit of a hybrid where they have partial resiliency for certain circuits in their business that they would like to keep energized.
Great. And so in the National Electrical Code, the definition for microgrid says that you can connect to and disconnect from the grid. Are all your microgrids those types of microgrids? Or there's lots of other definitions of microgrids where you could have your own ashram on a hilltop in the Himalayas that's not connected to any grid like we all have. And especially CEOs like you that, probably need to relax, New York CEOs. And
do we ever relax?
Well, don't you have an ashram in the Himalayas that's not connected to any grid? And if we had that, would it be a microgrid? I guess that would be, a question just for somebody, just how you define it. One time I had somebody call it, I think it was like a mini grid when it wouldn't be able to connect to the grid. And I think IEEE has a different definition for microgrid. And then sometimes people have a microgrid definition that could be just, one house or, even some circuits in their house that are doing backup. And we have what's called the MID, the microgrid interconnect device. And it could be a village. There's no maximum size, I guess.
Yeah, I agree with you. And we are currently involved with just about every permutation of what you just described. Mm-hmm. Our most recent project in Southern California for Chick-fil-A was a project that doesn't have resiliency. Why? Because in SDG&E service territory, a lot of people there don't think there's a significant outage risk like you see up in PG&E service territory in Northern California for all the obvious reasons. So they elect to go without having resiliency, and that's fine. Really, the core of most of our projects tends to be a battery energy storage system using a very smart microgrid control mechanism. So that's sort of the heart of most of our systems.
So that's kind of interesting. So the Chick-fil-A in Southern California doesn't have backup, in other words, resiliency. And that's
Correct.
something that apparently happens a lot in Germany when people get batteries, is they have such a stable grid that they don't need to get backup. And a lot of people in Northern California, as you were saying, where we have wildfires and stuff like that, and we just have that independent attitude that you want to be able to have backup at the apocalypse and all that. We have that up here in Northern California, but where there's stable grids, if the grid's only down for 5 minutes a year, is it worth it to pay thousands of dollars for extra electronics that can isolate from the grid and backup circuits and all that? And it's probably not worth it to do that.
You're absolutely right, Sean. And actually, we have an in-between mechanism where we will put in a much larger battery that can provide not only the economic benefits that a battery provides, which is its primary purpose in our systems, but also can provide partial resiliency in terms of, hey, we have two circuits in a pharmacy. We have refrigeration behind the pharmacy counter that keeps really expensive drugs, at the proper temperature. We want that to have a certain level of resiliency. We think we need 2 hours. So if that's the case in that kind of application, we can probably provide that via the battery.
So backup circuits only for expensive drugs, none of the cheap ones. That sounds like a good idea to me, too.
Yeah, they don't need backup for the refrigerators out front with the soft drinks. That doesn't seem to be a primary issue for them.
Okay. And I know that there's some companies like SMA that even have inverters with what they call a secure power supply, where they do have the ability, and they've had this for a long time, just to do a backup of a single circuit without having to wire extra circuits with panel boards and stuff like that. It's just like a circuit right out of the inverter, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, I would characterize it as load shedding capability. So in order to do that, we typically have a smart switch that's dedicated to directing power from the battery to those select circuits, and all the other circuits are shed. So we call it load shedding software. And, that's what you do in your home when you have a backup generator. Typically in a residential application, the generator isn't sized to your peak demand plus a safety margin. It's usually much less. And then you have load shedding software that says, okay, we won't allow all the zones in your air conditioning system in your house to fire up at the same time. So they can only operate individually. So you shed if you have 3 zones, only one can operate, the other 2 are shed, but it's done in a smart way so that it keeps your house relatively cool. And that way you don't need a 25 kW generator. You might get away with something, much less.
Great. Yeah, that's always been a point of confusion. People studying the National Electrical Code and microgrid interconnect devices, automatic transfer switches. Do you have to back up the full calculated load? And they say that with an automatic transfer switch, you do. And with a microgrid interconnect device, that you don't. So you can only just have to back up the largest load with all of your different sources of electricity. And usually we're talking about inverters, but you can have generators and all that too.
You're absolutely right. The interesting thing about it is it's a fascinating process, right? Because one of the things we're trying to do, one of the core value propositions we offer is cost savings. You put in one of our systems, you will save on your electric bill. And the way we do that is using cheaper solar array power and using a smart battery that takes advantage of time of use arbitrage, as well as peak demand shaving. If you have a tariff, that allows you to do that. But the peak demand shaving is where life gets interesting, as you know. In a typical peak demand utility bill scenario, you look for that peak demand in a 15-minute interval over the last month, and that drives your peak demand charge. So our system is trying to shave all those peaks to reduce your peak demand charge. you can't afford to miss one, because if your system isn't agile enough and smart enough, you might miss one of those peaks, and then that's it. That you're going to be charged for that peak that you missed with our system. And so that's why a microgrid that's focused on customer savings, as we are, has to be not only smart and agile, but it's got to be set up in a way where we know very, very detailed what the customer's tariff is, how it works, how their bill is calculated, and then our system has to be designed and operated in a way to complement that.
What I've always thought too is that there could be a benefit to hooking up neighbors. And so if like 2 different neighbors, 5 different neighbors had different solar systems, energy storage systems, loads, and all that, and if you could coordinate those neighbors, then if one of those neighbors had a peak and the other ones didn't, they can kind of get together and help out the grid a lot. But then there's all these laws that you can't pretty much sell electricity or connect to your neighbor's grid because the utility has the right to have a monopoly. Or do you run into any of that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges we have is, every state is different, every ISO is different, every utility is different, every utility tariff is different. In Northern California, for example, in PG&E service territory, you might have a retail business that's under a B19 tariff or a B10 tariff. They kind of target the same type of customer. The B19 is much more heavily weighted towards peak demand, whereas the B10 less so. And so we come across customers that are the same business, just 2 different locations in PG&E, and they might have B10, they might have B19. So, depending upon which one you have, our system design will be different. So, it's complicated. It's not easy. It's not one size fits all.
I just had an idea. So if you can't connect a conductor, you pretty much can't even put an extension cord over the fence, I don't think, at least where I live. So what if you had a bidirectional electric vehicle and you drove the energy next door? Maybe that would do it.
Exactly. And surprisingly enough, we are actually looking at a new potential business based upon, mobile battery energy storage systems at a very large level, at a large C&I scale level.
Yeah, or perhaps even if you can't run electrons, maybe you could run chemicals and have a little hydrogen pipeline. I should get one hydrogen pipeline between myself and the old lady next door. That's probably a really good idea.
What could possibly go wrong with that?
Yeah.
I'm picturing the Hindenburg all of a sudden.
Yeah, I guess we need to do it in a place without oxygen. I'll put that on my Mars chateau, and then we won't have as much of a problem there.
There you go.
With all the hydrogen. Yep. So I noticed too, looking at your LinkedIn profile, which we will put in the show notes with SolMicrogrids web address and things like that, that you have a nice business degree and an engineering degree. And I know that a lot of people say that's just, ideal as far as, like a lot of people would look back and go like, man, when I went to college, I wish I got a business degree and an engineering degree. Then I could be a big time CEO like Kirk Edelman of this really important, energy company. So how is it having that knowledge that, you have the engineering knowledge and the business knowledge? A lot of times people go to school and they study something, even doctors, they get their medical doctor degree and then they're terrible at running a business and they don't teach them a thing about running a business, or engineers, of course, same thing. And so you have both. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I often tell people, you look at someone's background on LinkedIn, let's say, and often it looks like it made perfect sense, the way they progressed through their career. But in reality, at least for me and for I suspect a lot of people, you just are trying to be in the best possible, position at every point in your career, but you don't have some master plan. A lot of it is just being at the right place at the right time. And I think in my case, that was a big part of it. But I will tell you, Sean, having someone who understands the engineering, especially in the world of electricity, which is very difficult because it's hard to visualize, and then having the ability to get your arms around the economics, those are 2 skills that really are complementary, I think. One of the things I think I'm pretty good at is taking a complex topic and being able to explain it either verbally or in writing in a way that someone who is not familiar with this goes, oh, okay, I get it. And I think not everybody can do that, but being able to do that helps advance a lot of business activity. And this is a great example because most people are clueless about things like how electricity works. Most people never really look closely at their utility bills at their primary residence. You get this bill every month, it's got a lot of pages, there are a lot of numbers on it. And most people go, whoa, what the heck is this all about? How much do I owe this month? And does that number seem high or low to me? And that's about the amount of analysis that goes into it. But once you get behind the curtain in the world of utilities and you see how tariffs are constructed and how they bill for what they provide you and why they have to do it that way, there's a little bit of historical precedent behind that. All of a sudden it makes a whole lot more sense. And one of my big goals in my role is trying to talk to new customers and explain what I just rambled on about in a way where they go, okay, I guess that makes sense. Thank you. So a big part of what we do when we present a new customer with a bill, we usually have a little bit of a one-on-one with them where we walk through, okay, here's your utility bill. This is what we take from that bill. This is what we use in our billing. And this is why it all complements. And this is why at the end of the day, you can see you've made this much savings from working with us and your utility. That's complicated, but I think we've got it down to the point where most people can follow, what our value proposition is.
Yep. One of the things that I've noticed throughout my career in this industry is that there are a lot of people that are out there running a business that don't understand the basics. Like there'll be some company that was run by somebody that was, hands-on, and the company grows and they bring in a professional CEO that doesn't know the difference between a kilowatt and a kilowatt hour. And they kind of run it into the ground, I've seen. And that goes for, running a company, or even the person that's, working in the company, the solar installer, the electrician, things like that. And they call it the solar coaster. So there's ups and downs on the way up. Anything that grows as fast as this industry is going to have volatility. So there's going to be like quick downs and big quick ups. The ups are going to outweigh the downs, of course, with this kind of logarithmic or exponential growth. So I think that it's really important for people in this industry to just have some basic knowledge. And there's plenty of, solar installers that don't know the difference of power and energy, but they're good at twisting bolts. And when it comes time to pick who's going to keep their job, if there's if they have to lay off a few people because there's going to be one of those downs on the solar coaster, they're going to keep the ones that understand some of these concepts. And so I think it's admirable that you have engineering knowledge besides business knowledge being a CEO. I think there's a lot of CEOs that could even benefit from taking something like the NABCEP associate exam, which is just like studying for a week pretty much, And another thing that I've noticed too is there's tons of overlap. Like if you come from a different career where it's science or, things like that, even a medical doctor, they're learning chemistry, trigonometry. We're all made up of these different components, electrons, energy, kilowatt hours, calories, all those things. And so it's really important, I think, for people to kind of understand what they're doing, especially if they want to survive the volatility.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And where you see that pop up, and you can usually tell if someone sort of understands the basics or not. When you say, okay, your bill is made up of an energy charge and a demand charge. And the energy charge is in kilowatt hours. Demand charge is based upon kilowatts. So you got power versus energy. And people look at you and they go, what? But the way we bill for demand versus the way we bill for energy is different. And it becomes a little bit confusing. And as I mentioned before, being able to explain to people, how it works and why it works that way is a big part of what we do with new customers.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. And I do think too that it's like you have to really know a subject so you can explain it to somebody. And that's really important. One thing that I like doing too is like if I'm at somebody's house and the solar salesperson calls on the phone, is to just start quizzing them. Like, what's the difference of power and energy? Put them on the spot.
Exactly. What's a photon? They'll think
Yeah.
it's something from Star Trek.
Yeah. And then if they're one of those tacky salespeople, then they will, make something up or. But yeah,
Yeah.
I guess photons are from Star Trek. They're from everything. They're coming out of our
Yep.
bodies, on the
Yep.
infrared spectrum. Great. So what can you offer to people? What are you looking for?
Yeah, we're doing some interesting things, and we just rolled out the first of two new initiatives, which I'm really excited about. Our primary business for the company's been around for about 5 years, has been to develop, own, and operate microgrid systems or DER systems, primarily at sort of retail sites.
Let's just say distributed energy resources for people that don't know what DER is. Yeah.
Exactly. And so, that's what we've been focused on. And right now we're doing a couple of things. One is we're leaning more towards entry into some new industries that will support larger microgrid systems, which I think is really exciting for us. And you'll see more and more of that if you follow us, if you see our website, if you see our press releases. And so that's a big deal for us. And we will be announcing shortly a couple of new projects in totally different industries that we've been used to operating in the past.
When you say larger, what kind of size?
Yeah, right now in the food service industry, we're, 100 to 250 kW arrays, and then
Mm-hmm.
all the other components are sized around that. In these new areas, we're going in, and like, for example, one of which is big box retail. Suddenly we'll be putting in arrays that are double or triple that size and batteries that are much bigger. And that's exciting for us. And I think it'll be really the next chapter of what I hope is the accelerated growth of SolMicrogrid. So that's kind of obvious. We're going out into tangential markets and trying to do bigger projects. But we recently announced something that we call Array to Microgrid, which I am very excited about. And we've gotten some really good feedback in the market. And the basic gist behind this initiative is we want to buy CNI solar systems that have been installed, been operating, and are owned by the people who are using the power. So some developer came to a CNI customer and said, you have a big roof, you use a lot of power, we'll put an array on, we'll sell it to you, and you'll cut your utility bill by X%. And maybe someone's done that and got some incentives, and a few years has gone by, and they're like, yeah, this has been good, but now what? We don't want to be in the energy business. Maybe we've gotten the savings we hoped, maybe we didn't. What we'd like to do is come to them and say, listen, what we will do is we will buy your array that you own on the roof of your building. We'll buy it from you for cash up front. We will convert it into a microgrid, which will give you additional benefits. And we will do all of that on an energy as a service basis. So what that means for this customer is, wait a minute, okay, it's not the shiny new toy anymore, this thing on my roof. Maybe I've had some O&M issues. I don't know, whatever it might be. Now I can get cash for it. I can monetize that and take the cash and put it in my primary business. I'm out of the energy business. You guys at SolMicrogrid now take responsibility for it. And then you're going to add a fancy battery, which creates more savings. You might provide full resiliency with a genset, partial resiliency with a battery. You're going to have a microgrid control system. If you want, we can put in a generator. We can put in a fuel cell. If you want EV charging, we can put in EV charging. All of that will be under our project, our capital, no money from you, Mr. Customer, and we're writing you a check to buy your array. That is
Wow.
Array to Microgrids.
That's pretty cool. So it gives a business some cash, and some businesses, who knows, maybe it would save them from going under. You got a big solar array and it's dirty, it needs to be cleaned, there's some broken inverters up there, and then there you go, sell it to Kirk Edelman and SolMicrogrid. What a deal. Okay.
Exactly.
Can I sell you just like one module that's on my roof? There's just one that I just want to sell.
Probably not. Like I said earlier, we're trying to go bigger. So one of the niceties about this is our initial folks that have reached out to us and we've identified, they tend to be bigger rooftop type array systems, and they need a little bit of work. You nailed it. I mean, we all know inverters tend to be a little bit difficult at times, and maybe they have some operating issues that they haven't really been able to address. they can forget about that. They don't have to worry about that system anymore. And we're going to save the money. And we're going to show you right up front, if we do this for you, we're going to create this much value, and we're going to split the value we create. We've got to take it, a lot of it, to pay back our costs and our capital and pay for everything we're giving you. But you're going to get a check for your system, and we're going to tell you this is the savings you're going to get going forward. And if we get more savings, we both benefit. If we get less savings, we both take the hit. But we're on the same side of the table. And I think that transparency makes people feel a lot more comfortable.
Yeah, and I also think too, with utility rates changing and the need for energy storage and adding electric vehicles, and pretty soon it'll be like bidirectional electric vehicles, virtual power plants where you can send your electrons in all different directions. It gets pretty complicated, and especially for just the average building owner. So the old solar systems, it was a lot simpler. You just have net metering, you send it back, you get full credit and all that kind of stuff. And so when you're adding all these things and you have somebody that doesn't have the engineering and business degree, that's just running a business day to day, and they might be able to even save more money by doing what you're saying, plus get a check, I would think. It just seems like it's kind of a neat idea. Did you invent it? Did you come up with the idea?
But I was at Microgrid Knowledge Conference talking to Rod Walton, and he said he hadn't heard of anybody else really doing this. Probably there are people out there that will tell you, especially now, that they will do it. But I think it's a part of the market that's been somewhat ignored, and I think it gives people a tremendous way to sort of have a second bite at the apple. Hey, once upon a time, I liked the idea of going solar, but it's been a little bit more cumbersome than I'd like. And we're in the business of making widgets, not producing energy. So this is a way forward where they kind of get the best of both worlds. And by monetizing that asset, maybe they have a better use for that capital than having it tied up in a solar array on the roof of their C&I structure.
So when you're doing something like this, do you have to worry as much? I guess you don't, maybe, about tax credits and things like that. I guess maybe you're adding new energy storage, so you would have to, take that into consideration.
Yeah, the array usually has monetized those incentives by then, but maybe not, and we can deal with it one way or the other. There are some incentives for storage, so maybe we pick up some benefits there. But, at the end of the day, it's all about creating value from our perspective. We're super transparent, and we're going to show you the value we think we can create. Now, nothing's written in stone, right? I mean, it's all based upon having those photons come down and strike your modules. That's what starts this whole value chain. And for example, in Northern California, in a couple of recent months, we've been underproducing just because it's been cloudier than, the 20-year average. So that's the risk you take when you're in the solar business. So yeah, it's not like a fossil plant where you can tell and decide in advance how much you're going to produce every day. There is some variability there. So we try to create value. We try to make it very clear how it's created. It's going to change from month to month, but the math is right there on the bill that we give our customers. And hopefully that reduces some of their anxiety over, hey, am I getting what I thought I'd get? And what happened last month, Kirk? I thought I was going to get X and I got less than X. And, I can point out on their bill, hey, what the problem was? We had less sunshine. Mm-hmm. Hopefully next month we'll have above average sunshine. In the summer we do a lot better than in the winter in our California projects for the obvious reasons. So, but I think transparency and the value proposition tied to that transparency is key for us. And hopefully at the end of the day, our customers we've sort of demystified not only the industry and the technology, but also the billing and how everyone is compensated.
So I suppose that there's a lot of people out there that don't even own their systems, like it's a PPA or there's a lease or something going on. And I also suppose that with the right contract, you can still do this with them, but maybe they won't be getting the same kind of check. How does that work?
Exactly. I mentioned earlier, every system is sort of bespoke. We will come across at times a system where, for a variety of reasons, maybe it makes sense to simply put a solar array up. Maybe the battery, because of the way their tariff is structured, the battery doesn't really pay for itself and create value, so we won't have one. Maybe they don't want resiliency. There's no generator. So at the end of the day, it's a C&I solar project. And, we can do that. Happy to do that. At the end of the day, though, it's how do we create the most value? If that's the way we create the most value, that's what we'll build.
Great, great. And so I noticed that you're owned by Morgan Stanley. How does that work? And did you know that I am actually related to JP Morgan? It's on the family tree. It's super distant. There's probably like one little molecule on my chromosome that I share with JP Morgan or the other JP Morgan, the father of JP Morgan.
Oh, that's some impressive genetics, John. Yeah, we are a portfolio company of Morgan Stanley Energy Partners, which is their private equity business focused on investing in the energy space. And, that provides some advantages. They've got a large team. They're very smart. They understand our business really, really well. But more importantly, we're trying to build an operating portfolio of projects, and I could not do that without their capital. So they provide us with tremendous connections, tremendous energy technical capabilities, and probably most importantly, they're funding us. And I can't ask for a better partner than the Morgan Stanley Energy Partners team. Without them, we wouldn't be able to do what we're doing.
Great. And as I always say, keep it in the family, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, I have a grandpa Morgan, a cousin Morgan, and I do have it on the family tree, but it is, like I said, extremely distant. I guess there were some brothers that came over from Wales, and one of those brothers was ancestor of the JP Morgans, and there's actually a couple of JP Morgans. A lot of people think it's just one person, but of course, that was a long time ago, and that's a great partner to have. I know that JP Morgan, they say, even helped save the economy and prevented a recession and things like that way back in the day. So there's a lot of interesting stories back there. And of course, you're in New York where all the world financial things happen. We interrupt you for a very important announcement. Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast has been brought to you by Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast. That's right, Sean White is sponsoring his own podcast, and he wants to remind you to go check out some of his classes. You can go to SolarSEAN, that's SolarSEAN.com, and then click on the links to check out his classes. You can check out his heat spring classes, and you can also hire him to teach classes for you, like at your company, something like that. Now back to the show. Let's see. So who are you looking for a customer? Do you want some people to give you a call that have a nice big solar array that's 10 years old and they're wanting to get some batteries or, EV chargers and things like that?
Yeah, they can go to our website, SolMicrogrid.com. In there, you'll see something. We have our main microgrid business, then we have a section under solutions called Microgrids and More. And in that section, you'll see a couple of options. We've talked about a few of them on this podcast, but there's a button on each one where if you click it, you'll get a nice little summary of what it's all about and everything you need to know, initially at least, from a customer perspective. So I would urge people, if you have an existing array and you want to try to get more value out of it, if you want to monetize it and get out of the energy business, track us down, look us up. You can go to our website. You can see our little sales flyer that describes the program in some detail. And yeah, that's step one.
Great, great. And what about people that don't have a solar array? Are you going after that market too?
Oh, absolutely. That's our primary business, Sean. That's what we've been doing for the last several years, and that will remain our primary business. The array to microgrid is sort of just a different spin on that, but our primary business is talking to customers who say, okay, Kirk, you tell me that I can put an array on my property and maybe use this fancy battery and you'll reduce my costs, your energy costs significantly. And I say, yep, and it's no cost to me. And you'll do all this. We take care of all the permitting, all the engineering, all the construction. The actual construction, as you know, on site is fairly short for these kind of systems, a couple of months, and then you're good to go. And I think it's a real win-win for everybody. But it does depend upon things like, what does your site look like? Where are we going to put the arrays? What does your tariff with your local utility look like? In California, a lot of people don't even realize it, but they're enrolled automatically in CCAs, and they're getting the benefits of some renewable energy already. and then they don't even know it. So a lot of what we do is going back to customers saying, oh, by the way, according to your PG&E tariff, you're enrolled in the Sonoma Clean Energy Cooperative, and you're getting up to 50% of your power right now from renewable sources at a discount. And they go, oh, wow, I didn't know that. So, this is what we do. And a lot of what we do is just trying to explain to people what they have, what we can do. And sometimes we go back and we say, we can create value, but it's probably not enough to get you as well as ourselves excited. So, you probably are best positioned the way you are. That doesn't happen very often, but it can. Other times we go back and we say, gosh, we have all sorts of things we can do. It's really up to you, customer, what you're comfortable with. And I say that because some people say, I really don't want a generator in my parking lot. That seems like not the best use of my parking lot. And so we'll say, well, okay, then we don't have to do that. If you don't need resiliency, we certainly don't have to do that. And some people, have concerns about various battery storage technologies. And so we can talk about that and we can explain the different options that we have. By the way, Sean, we are technology agnostic, EM agnostic. We try to use whatever's best for that particular application. So our modules, our inverters, our batteries, our gensets, they can vary manufacturer from site to site. We try to use whatever makes the most sense.
Great. So you mentioned CCAs, and let me just talk a little bit about that because I'm very familiar with them. CCA stands for Community Choice Aggregation. And my friend, one of my best friends, Paul Finn, wrote the CCA law in the 90s, and that's what got me into solar. In fact, my first solar job was probably like making signs promoting CCAs back in the 90s. I remember going to like the San Francisco City Hall and with him to different meetings and things like that. And pretty much what they do is they separate out the purchasing of the electricity. And so they'll let the municipality, like the city or the county, procure their electricity, but they won't put the utility out of business. So the utility gets to stick around. The state has to pass a CCA law. So if your state doesn't have a CCA law, you can get them to pass one. And the electricity is almost always going to be greener and less expensive. So CCAs are pretty cool. Community choice aggregation. So another thing I was wondering about SolMicrogrid for people that want to do business with you is, where do you focus doing business? I know you're mentioning Northern California and Southern California, and you are in Manhattan. I can see Manhattan buildings behind you. So where do you like to do business?
Yeah, we will go wherever we can create the most value. And that value is created from a number of different dynamics that are site specific. And this is true for, solar, really true for renewable energy in general. Some places people are paying a lot more for their power than other places. And the more people are paying for grid power, the better our value proposition is, because I keep saying we create value. The top of this band that we create is really, what's your alternative? If you buy kilowatt hours from your utility, that's here. And down here is, what can we produce those kilowatt hours for? And if we supplement this up here by doing like 40, 50, 80, whatever the percentage of the power the array creates with the battery, we can expand that value. So we're looking for that biggest band. So where that tends to send us are the usual solar states. And when I say solar states, a lot of people assume, the sunniest states. And it's not really the sunniest states. It's the states that have the best overall environment to support renewable energy. And California has always been at the forefront of this. So all of us in the renewable space, California is a very attractive market. Once upon a time, we were doing a lot out in Hawaii. Back in the Northeast, up in New England and the Middle Atlantic states, there are some really good opportunities that are sort of but they're similar value propositions that you see in California. So if you look at where microgrids are, if you look at where solar is, existing solar, you tend to see it on the coasts, maybe a little bit around Chicagoland, a lot down in ERCOT in Texas. And that's because it's a combination of, yes, having more sun helps, but it's not the end all. You don't see as much in states like New Mexico and Arizona or Florida. And they say, well, why is that? And I usually go back and I say, well, value is created through not only creating power as cheaply as possible, which solar has quickly become, a great choice for that. But we also have federal incentives, we have state incentives, and those are all big drivers of where we can do this most profitably. How a state deals with RECs is a bit of a driver. And then you have the utility and the authorities having jurisdiction. We deal with utilities for interconnection, and that can be slightly painful to very painful.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have authorities having jurisdiction, typically municipalities, but sometimes counties, that you have to go through for permitting. When you put all of that together, that spits out places where the ability for us to execute is easier than other places. So we'll go wherever it makes sense. We're also getting involved increasingly in the provinces in Canada. And yeah, exciting times, but it does get a little bit complicated, a little bit technical because of everything I just rambled on about, Sean, explaining incentives to people. And I don't mean necessarily just all tax incentives, but there's all sorts of incentives that are out there in various spots in the country that you may or may not want to take advantage of. Demand response programs. You could have a whole nother hour of discussion on how demand response is impacting our business and the ability to do our business, profitably. So I think it's very exciting, but it adds on a layer of complexity, which, going back to my original concept, I try to make these things less complex for our customers. But when they say, well, do I want to have my system enrolled in a demand response program? That's another conversation.
Uh-huh. Maybe we could talk a little bit about demand response. And so demand response has been around for quite a while, like probably many decades, I guess. And if the grid needs a little bit more electricity, there's things that you can turn off. I guess it would be one way of putting it. So like if you have a battery, you could put more energy into the grid. That would even be more helpful. But if you just have an air conditioner, you could maybe turn it off for 5 minutes, something like that. And do you know how all of that gets coordinated? I know it's pretty complicated, and you said it could take a whole hour to talk about it.
Well, demand response programs are, all different all over the country, and some are more straightforward than others. Most people think of demand response as, okay, on a 90-degree day, the utility is going to force me to turn my thermostats up to 80, and I'll make some money for that. Do I want to do that or not? I'm running a retail business. Do I want people to be sweating in my retail business? Is the juice worth the squeeze?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a decision that everybody has to make, that kind of program. But there's other flavors of demand response. Some are even more onerous than that example, and some are less. On the lesser side, some of the programs you see out there, I think, are really exciting because they say, listen, if you have a battery, sometimes even a generator, but more often than not a battery, and you're operating that battery and discharging, kilowatt hours that you're using on site, we will pay you extra because you did that during a period of stress that the utility had. And that's kind of a neat demand response because that's what the battery's probably going to do regardless if you're enrolled in the system or not. And by saying that an array or a battery being used on site reduces the need for a kilowatt hour from the local utility, that's a win-win, and so that's a great example of a kind of a generic demand response that I would love to enroll all of my projects in because it's not going to change the way we operate. Some people think of demand response as sort of like a utility SCADA system where when I need my power the most and the grid is stressed, they're going to somehow take control of my system. I will have no control over it and divert those kilowatt hours to the grid when I really wanted them for my business. And that scares people. And that's kind of another flavor of demand response. But they're all different styles, all different programs. Some I think are no-brainers and you want to enroll your project in, others less so. But it's just another thing that we definitely sit down and talk to our customer about because we want them to know exactly, hey, this is what it means. This is what it means for you. And, oh, by the way, we both are going to benefit from being enrolled in this demand response program. We're in it together. And I'll explain to you why you probably should not be concerned. It doesn't mean you're going to lose your air conditioning on that 90-degree plus day. That's not the way this DR program operates. But it does get complicated because they're all different flavors of DR programs.
Yeah, I sometimes look at the future and think that there's going to be a big need for matching policy with software, with energy as a service, software as a service, coders, I guess, or now maybe AI can do a lot of the coding, but just coordinating where the electricity goes at different times and making sure that it's safe and secure so the North Korean hackers don't go take over our coffee machines.
Yeah, yeah.
And smart appliances, even your refrigerator, could just be, if you get a million refrigerators in Manhattan, that could make a difference if you just made it come on staggered or something by seconds or.
Exactly. Exactly. One of the things we deal with is on trying to shave peak demand in California with retail customers. Most people say, oh, my peak demand is probably in the late afternoon. People are getting off work, the typical demand curve. And so we probably have to be really careful. And it's in California, the peak demand period tends to be 4 to 9 p.m. in the afternoon. So we're going to really focus on that. But then you find out with a lot of retail, they have a peak demand spike when they open up at 6 o'clock in the morning. And, it's only for a couple of minutes, but that
Mm-hmm.
often drives their peak demand for the entire month. And so people go, what's going on there? And I said, it's because you're turning everything on, particularly rotating equipment at the exact same time. If you just took a few minutes and turned things on in stages over the course of, a half hour or so, you could take that peak demand. Instead of it looking like this, it might be like this. And
Yeah.
that's a classic example.
And I imagine that with some businesses, that could cost thousands of dollars a month.
Absolutely. We're constantly monitoring. All of our systems have real-time monitoring. I can watch in real time exactly, where the power is going and where it comes from and what the demand is at the site. And it's amazing sometimes what causes a spike. And if you do a little bit of digging afterwards, you'll find out, for example, at one of our sites recently, there was a spike at an unusual time. And it was because they hosted a large group at that site. A large group of customers came in. They knew about it way in advance. And it just caused a spike for a bunch of different reasons. And fortunately, our sophisticated battery immediately kicks in and displaces a big part of that demand. So we avoid a peak demand charge. But that's a great example. And you see it in your own house. A lot of people, particularly if you have older air conditioning systems, when one of their compressors turns on, the lights flicker for a second in their house.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a great example of what we're talking about that people tend to relate to.
Yeah, and demand charges are usually for businesses, but there are some places where you have demand charges for residential. For instance, my daughter lives in Scottsdale, Arizona, and I was looking at her bill thinking about, getting her solar, and it didn't really make sense to get her solar. It's almost like I was wondering if the utility did it on purpose, if they made it so that there was higher demand charges for their revenue that they needed to get and lower energy charges so people would not get solar, and then that way they could put the solar in the big solar farms and make the money themselves, perhaps.
Well, yeah, and you look at tariffs, and I'll keep talking about California. If you look at the tariffs in California, and you realize, the peak power is like 4 to 9, and in the winter, definitely, and even in the shoulder months, the arrays are not providing a lot of value from 4 to 9. Maybe in the winter you get a little bit from 4 to 5, but the sun goes down, and then that's not a resource that's providing a lot of value. So what do we in the industry do? That's a great example for where battery storage can help. And when you see these great demand curves that come out of California periodically that show the huge impact that solar has on that, and the so-called duck curve that everyone talks about. And now you see, solar knocks down demand in the middle part of the day so much, and then you see the shoulders where you see a lot more battery output coming in now. But a lot of times people look at what we do and they say, well, how come your solar was basically offsetting so much off-peak power? And that's because I think the utilities, look at it and they say, well, we're going to get the solar, and that makes the middle part of the day more off-peak from the utility perspective. And there's nothing wrong with that. I get it because that solar comes in and they're going to get it. And so maybe that is off peak from a utility mindset. But it really places an emphasis on people like me to figure out solutions that address particularly that peak period. So that's typically 4 to 9 in California. And, the array will help, especially in the summer. But if you're not in the summer, you need an array plus a battery. And then you can use the battery to discharge from 5 to 9 and really knock down your use of peak power.
Maybe what we could do is we could just change the time zones so 9 p.m. is more like 2 p.m.
Exactly.
I think I just got back from China, and I think they have one time zone for all of China, and they should probably have about 5. And I think out there over in Western China, it would be something like that if, peak sun in the evening.
Yeah.
And some other ways, too, that people will figure out how to make more energy in the evening is having trackers, like for the utility scale projects. So they'll go east in the morning, so it's just not so much peaking in the middle of the day. And it's actually flat in the middle of the day with a tracker instead of facing south. So you'd actually be making a little bit less at noon when there's that overabundance anyway. And then you point to the west in the evening, and that really helps for the head of the duck there on the duck curve that you were talking about. And so the head of the duck is just that difference between how much you're making and how much you're using. And everybody uses more electricity, it tends to be in the evening, because they're at work, they're at home, they're at the mall, they're doing everything all at once. They want to come home, plug in their car, turn things on, all that. And some other things are facing your PV to the west. So if somebody has like an east and west facing roof, they can point it to the west. You could even do it on a low slope roof or a carport, anything like that. West is the best, as Jim Morrison says. And so there's lots of different ways where you can do, help out a little bit, but then you just can't beat energy storage, where you put it in the battery and use it at a different time. Or you can just use electricity at a different time and, turn things on at a different time, have a smart building.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. There's all sorts of different ways to help mitigate some of this. And, the industry has done a good job. Single and dual axis trackers, which is what you were referring to, on particularly utility scale projects, you tend to see that a lot. The drives tend to be a little temperamental at times. So it does cause some O&M issues. And now with the cost of modules coming down, I tell people, 6 years ago, I think that's about the right time frame. Don't hold me to it. But I don't know, 5 to 10 years ago, we were using 200-watt modules that cost a lot more than today's modules. Today, I'm deploying primarily 600-plus watt bifacials that cost a fraction of that 200-watt module, 5 to 10 years ago. And why did that happen? That's the beauty of technology. We've really costed out over time. And we once upon a time, not that long ago, people kind of poo-pooed PV solar because they said it's too expensive. It's too expensive to produce electricity from that technology. Now, a lot of people claim it's the cheapest way to produce electricity. And, how did that happen? I think it's a real testament to our tech capabilities and our construction technology nowadays, where you can make those huge strides. We saw it in the wind business as well. So that's why, incentives to get sort of these nascent industries off and running are often, I think, well served. But then eventually they don't need those incentives and they phase out naturally, and the industry can stand on its own 2 feet. And I think that's what you're starting to see in the world of PV solar.
Yeah, and there is a lot of complicated things out there. There's, like where the electrons are going to be going, and the batteries and the PV and the loads and all that kind of stuff. So I guess it's nice to have different companies doing energy as a service, so you don't have to worry about that as a building owner, because, it's like, what are you going to do otherwise? If you don't have the software doing it or the people that understand what's going on, you're going to stand out there and go like, oh, I better turn this off, better turn that on. okay, we can't have all the people show up at the same time. People aren't going, even though you say like, oh, you should stagger turning on things and when you walk in the building, they're probably not going to do it, even though they know they should. So you need to be able to automate all this stuff. And it's pretty complicated, but I could imagine just 10 years from now, it's going to look a lot different.
Oh, I think so. I mean, that's the beauty of the industry. There's constant innovation. And just to, from our perspective, because, and you've heard me say this multiple times today, because we charge a customer based upon the value we create, and we both take part of that value, that's our business model, our customers can rest assured that, hey, if there's a way 5 years from now where we can put some money into the system on your site and we can create more value, we're going to do it because we take part of that value. And then in turn, you take part of that value. So it's a win-win. So that I think helps our customers sort of, sleep at night knowing, hey, these guys aren't out there to like take a bigger piece of a pie and it's at my expense. They're going to try to ensure that the system on my property is creating the most value on the most cost efficient basis because we both win. And that's, I think, the beauty of our approach to energy as a service.
Great. Okay. Let's see. Is there any other things that you want to cover?
Well, one other thing I'll mention, Sean, is I mentioned earlier about microgrids and more, some of these initiatives. Array to microgrids, which we've talked about, is out there. We're pitching it. It's getting, good response. We are about to unveil another initiative, sort of a cousin to Array to microgrids, which we'll probably end up calling Energy as a Service Partner Program. And what we're going to do is our customer there is going to be C&I solar developers. And you say, wait a minute, that seems sort of like your customer is going to be your competition. But what I think we have out in the market is there's a lot of folks who develop and flip these projects. They don't have the desire to own and operate. They may not have the financial wherewithal to own and operate. So they make a very good business out of a build and sell, develop and flip type of business model. And there, a lot of times I think their customer will say, I like the idea of saving money using solar, but I don't want to get in the energy business myself. I don't want to write you a big check. Is there another way? And that's where we come in. We'll come in and stand between the develop and flip model and the customer, and this entity here can sell it to us, and then we'll enter into an energy as a service agreement with their original customer. Now it's our customer. And it's another win-win, I think, because it'll allow a lot of developers to basically provide a solution they can't provide today by bringing us into the transaction. So that's something that is not even on our website yet, but it will be announced shortly. And I think that's just another innovative way for us to build our operating fleet and get more and more assets that we're managing, operating, and essentially build our business. So keep an eye open for that. I think that'll be received in the market similar to our Array to microgrids as being a little bit innovative and addressing a need.
Great. And what do you call that?
Energy as a Service Partners Program.
Energy as a Service Partners Program. Well, I can't wait to partner with you with my single solar module on that one that's over my head right now. There's just one that I want to do. All right.
We prefer if it was slightly bigger, Sean.
Okay. Got to start somewhere, Okay, great. And where do people find you?
Yeah, easiest way is go to SolMicrogrid.com. One word, SolMicrogrid.com. Everything you need to know about us is there. Easy to reach out to us. Would love to hear from people. Like I've tried to convey today, we provide a basic service, but then we have a couple of different permutations which are meant to address what we think are opportunities in the market.
Great. Well, yeah, it was really good talking to you. I hope to see you in person sometime. You probably go to the RE Plus conference or something like that, maybe. I'll run into you there. I was just hanging out with the guy that runs the conference over in China. So,
oh, wow.
His name's Stephen Miner. We were hanging out. So, yeah.
Oh, that's great. No, that's a big industry event, as you know, and we'll have a team there as well. We try to go to as many as makes sense. I go to the Microgrid Knowledge one every year. That's good. We also go to EEI Key Accounts, which is a surprisingly good energy opportunity that a lot of people don't realize. Edison Electric Institute is really the organization that tends to focus on investor-owned utilities. But twice a year, they have something called Key Accounts Conference, and it's all their big energy users. And it's designed so that if you're a big energy consumer, you can go to this conference and all the big utilities are there and they talk about best practices and what's going on. But they also allow people like me, whose target market are all these big energy users, to show up as well. And they actually promote certain aspects of the conference that get me to mingle with their big energy users. So it's become a increasingly valuable place for people like us to be. And I didn't really realize that until the last couple of years. So EEI Key Accounts, keep that in the back of your mind. It's a good conference.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't even know about that one. I'll check it out and I'll put all these different things in the show notes.
Yeah, sounds good.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Kirk Edelman, CEO of SolMicrogrids. That's SOL Microgrids. And thanks for listening to Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast. To find out more, go to SolarSEAN.com. Get yourself NABCEP certified. Make sure that you are resilient as a SolMicrogrid. Woo!